In the middle of the dusty village square, near Mbale, Joy Nibiria stood trembling, her hands wrapped protectively around her swollen belly. Voices circled her like stones. "Shameless girl," a woman shouted. "You have brought disgrace to this village," another cried. At the front of the crowd, Mzee Kato, the village elder, lifted his wooden staff and pointed toward the narrow road leading out of the village. "Leave before your child is born," he declared coldly. "We will not raise a bastard here." Joy's eyes filled with tears, but she did not move. Then suddenly, the distant roar of powerful engines broke the silence. 3 black luxury SUVs rolled slowly into the square, and the man who stepped out was staring directly at her, as if he had come back for her.
Before we continue, tell me something in the comments. Which country are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Stories like Joy's travel across continents, and it's always powerful to see how many places we are connected from. And if you believe stories about justice, courage, and unexpected redemption deserve to be heard, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. Now, let's go back to the beginning of Joy Nibiria's story.
Several months before the day the villagers gathered to shame her in the square, Joy Nibiria's life had been quiet, so quiet that most people in the village barely noticed her. She lived in a small mud brick house on the edge of the village, not far from the cassava fields that stretched toward the low green hills outside Mbale. The house leaned slightly to one side after years of heavy rain, but it was still strong enough to shelter 2 people, Joy and her grandmother, Jaja Namusoke. Every morning before the sun rose above the hills, Joy was already awake. The rooster's crow often found her outside, sweeping the small dirt courtyard with a handmade broom of palm twigs. The cool morning air carried the scent of wet soil and wood smoke drifting from neighboring homes. Inside, Jaja Namusoke would be sitting slowly on the wooden stool beside the charcoal stove. Her hair was silver, now braided carefully against her head, and the lines on her face told stories of many years lived through hardship. Yet her eyes remained sharp and warm. "You woke before the sun again," the old woman would say in a voice softened by age. Joy would smile. "If I sleep too long, the market women will take all the good customers." It was not entirely a joke. Joy earned their living selling vegetables in the small roadside market 2 kilometers away. Cassava, tomatoes, onions, sometimes ground nuts if the harvest had been kind. The work was not glamorous. On most days, she walked the dusty road balancing a woven basket on her head, greeting the same people she had known since childhood. But Joy never complained. Not when the rains ruined crops, not when traders bargained ruthlessly, not when the long walk home left her feet aching. Because for Joy, survival had never been guaranteed. Her parents had died when she was still a young girl. Fever had taken her mother first. Then a year later, her father had been killed in a construction accident in Kampala. From that moment, Jaja Namusoke had raised her alone. The old woman had never been wealthy, but she possessed something stronger than wealth: stubborn resilience. And Joy had inherited it. The villagers often described Joy as a quiet girl. She was not the kind who laughed loudly or attracted attention in the market. She dressed simply, usually in faded cotton skirts and a modest blouse. Her natural hair was braided neatly, and she carried herself with calm dignity. But those who looked closely saw something else: kindness. Joy had a habit of helping people without announcing it. If an elderly neighbor struggled with water containers, Joy carried them. If a child fell in the road, she cleaned the wounds. If someone had no food at the market, she sometimes slipped a tomato or cassava root into their hands without asking for payment. Jaja Namusoke used to shake her head when she noticed. "My granddaughter," she would say gently, "one day you will give away everything you own." Joy would laugh softly. "If someone needs it more than me, Jaja, how can I refuse?" The old woman never argued after that, but she sometimes worried, because kindness did not always protect people in a world where survival was hard. And their village, like many villages, could be both warm and cruel. In the evenings after the market closed, the trading center filled with gossip. Women gathered near the water well exchanging news while filling their yellow jerry cans. Men sat outside the small bar drinking warm beer and debating politics or football. And gossip moved faster than the wind. If a girl was seen walking with the wrong man, everyone knew by sunset. If a marriage failed, the story grew bigger with every retelling. And if a young woman made a mistake, especially one involving a man, the village could become unforgiving. Joy had seen it happen before. Years earlier, another girl from a nearby community had become pregnant without a husband. For weeks, the village whispered behind her back. Some refused to greet her. Others laughed openly when she passed. Eventually, the girl left. No one ever spoke about her again. Joy remembered the sadness in the girl's eyes the day she walked down the dusty road with a small bag in her hand. That memory had stayed with her. Perhaps that was why Joy avoided attention. She kept her life simple. Market, home, care for Jaja, nothing more. Yet even in such a quiet life, loneliness sometimes crept in. At night after dinner, Joy often sat outside beneath the mango tree beside their house. The sky above Mbale was enormous, full of stars that seemed close enough to touch. Crickets sang in the grass. Sometimes Joy wondered what life looked like beyond the hills. Kampala, the big cities, the highways she had only heard about. She imagined tall buildings, electric lights everywhere, and people who did not know every detail of each other's lives. But such thoughts always felt distant. Joy's world was small, and she had accepted that. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the hills gold, Joy returned from the market carrying the last of her vegetables. Jaja Namusoke was sitting outside, waiting for her. "You sold everything today?" the old woman asked. "Almost," Joy said, placing the basket down. "Good. Tomorrow will be another day." They sat together quietly. The air smelled of cooking fires beginning to light across the village. After a moment, Jaja spoke again. "You know, child," she said slowly, "life changes in ways we cannot predict." Joy smiled gently. "You always say that, Jaja, and it is always true." Joy leaned her head lightly against the old woman's shoulder. "I think my life will stay just like this," she said softly. Simple. Jaja Namusoke looked toward the road that disappeared between the hills. Her old eyes carried a wisdom that came from decades of watching fate surprise people. "No life stays the same forever," she said. Neither of them knew then how quickly that truth would arrive, because within days a stranger would appear on that very road. A man who would walk into Joy Nabiria's quiet life and change everything. The rain came suddenly that afternoon, the way it often did during the wet season in eastern Uganda. One moment, the sky above the hills near Mbale was clear and bright. The next moment, dark clouds rolled in, like a heavy curtain swallowing the sun. By the time Joy Nabiria finished selling the last of her tomatoes at the roadside market, the wind had already begun to rise. "Better hurry home," one of the older market women called to her. "That storm looks angry." Joy nodded and lifted her basket. The dusty road that connected the market to her village stretched for several kilometers between fields and scattered trees. On most days, the walk was peaceful, but today, the air felt restless. Thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the hills. Joy had walked only halfway when the rain finally burst open. It fell hard and fast, drumming against the earth and turning the narrow road into slippery red mud within minutes. Joy hurried beneath a large acacia tree beside the road, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. From there, she could see the curve of the road leading down from the highway. That was when she heard the sound. At first, it was faint, a grinding noise, then the sharp squeal of tires losing control. Joy stepped forward slightly, squinting through the curtain of rain. A dark vehicle appeared around the bend, sliding sideways on the wet road. The car skidded violently before slamming into a shallow ditch at the roadside. The crash was not loud enough to destroy the car, but it was sudden enough to make Joy's heart jump. For a moment, everything went quiet except for the rain. Joy hesitated. Most travelers used the main highway, not this smaller road leading toward the village. Whoever was inside the car might be hurt. Without thinking twice, she began running toward the vehicle. Mud splashed against her skirt as she reached the ditch. The car door opened slowly. A man stepped out. He was tall, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark skin and short-cropped hair soaked by the rain. His clothes were simple. A light shirt and dark trousers now stained with mud. He looked momentarily disoriented. When his eyes lifted and met Joy's, there was a brief flash of surprise. "You should not stand in the rain," he said, his voice calm despite the situation. Joy blinked. "You just crashed your car," she replied. The man glanced back at the vehicle. "I've had worse days," he said quietly. Joy stepped closer, examining him carefully. "Are you injured?" "No," he answered after a moment. "Just unlucky with the road." The rain continued, pouring heavily. Joy looked at the muddy ditch where the car was trapped. "You won't get that out today," she said honestly. The man followed her gaze and gave a faint smile. "I suspect you're right." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Joy suddenly realized something. "You're not from here," she said. "No," the man admitted. "My name is Daniel." "Joy," she said softly. Thunder rolled again. Joy looked down the road toward the village. "You can't stay here in the storm," she said. "Our house is not far." Daniel hesitated. "I wouldn't want to trouble you." "It's not trouble," Joy said simply. And that was the truth. Helping someone had never felt like trouble to Joy Nibiria. After a brief pause, Daniel nodded. Together they walked through the rain along the narrow road. Daniel carried nothing but a small leather bag that had somehow survived the crash. The distance to Joy's home was not long, but the rain made the path slippery. When they finally reached the small courtyard outside the mud brick house, Jaja Namusoke was already standing beneath the doorway watching the storm. Her old eyes immediately noticed the stranger. "Joy," she called. Joy approached with Daniel beside her. "Jaja, his car slipped off the road," she explained. "He needed shelter." The old woman studied Daniel for a moment. Then she stepped aside. "A traveler should never face a storm alone," she said. "Come inside." Daniel entered respectfully, lowering his head slightly in greeting. "Thank you, Jaja." The house was small but warm. A charcoal stove glowed in the corner. Joy quickly placed dry firewood on the coals while Jaja Namusoke brought a cloth for Daniel to dry himself. "You must eat," the old woman insisted. "There is little, but it is enough." Daniel tried to protest politely, but the old woman waved him silent. Within minutes, Joy served a simple meal of posho and beans. Daniel ate slowly, not because the food was unfamiliar, but because something about the moment felt strangely peaceful. Outside, the rain continued falling heavily against the roof. Inside the small house, the warm firelight softened the shadows. Daniel watched Joy quietly as she moved around the room helping her grandmother. She never asked questions about his background, never asked if he was wealthy, never asked where he came from or where he was going. She simply treated him like a guest. It had been a long time since anyone had done that. After dinner, Jaja Namusoke spoke gently. "You can sleep here tonight," she said. "Tomorrow we will see about your car." Daniel hesitated again, but exhaustion had already begun to weigh on his shoulders. "Thank you," he said. Joy prepared a small mattress near the corner of the room. The storm slowly faded during the night. When morning came, sunlight returned to the hills. Daniel stepped outside to inspect his car. It was still stuck in the ditch. Repairing it would take time, more time than he had planned. When he returned to the house, Joy was preparing to leave for the market. "You will need help getting the car out," she said. Daniel nodded. "I suppose I will stay a day or two." Neither of them knew then that those days would quietly change the direction of both their lives. Because the man who called himself Daniel Okello was not merely a traveler with bad luck on a rainy road. And the kindness Joy Nibiria had shown him without hesitation, without suspicion, would soon become something far more powerful than either of them expected, the kind of kindness that alters destinies. Daniel Okello expected to leave the village the very next day. That had been his plan when the rainstorm trapped his car in the muddy ditch along the roadside. Once the road dried, he assumed he would arrange help from Mbale town repair the vehicle and continue his journey back toward Kampala. But plans, Daniel had learned, rarely obeyed the neat timelines people created for him. The morning after the storm, he walked back down the road to inspect the car more closely. The vehicle was still tilted awkwardly in the shallow ditch. The wheels had sunk deep into the soft red earth. Daniel crouched beside it, examining the damage. The front axle had twisted slightly, and one tire had lost pressure. Nothing catastrophic. But the repair would not happen quickly in a small rural area with limited tools. He straightened slowly and looked toward the hills beyond the fields. For a brief moment, the silence of the countryside felt unfamiliar. Daniel had spent most of his life surrounded by noise. Phones ringing, business meetings, traffic roaring through Kampala's crowded streets, security teams moving around him like shadows. Yet here the air carried only the sound of wind through tall grass and distant goats bleating somewhere beyond the valley. It felt peaceful. By the time Daniel returned to Joy's house, she had already left for the market. Jaja Namusoke sat outside beneath the shade of the mango tree, carefully peeling cassava roots with a small knife. She glanced up when Daniel approached. "You found the problem with the car?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "It will take a few days." The old woman gestured toward a wooden stool beside her. "Then you will stay with us until it is fixed." Daniel hesitated briefly before sitting. "I appreciate your kindness." Jaja Namusoke studied him quietly for a moment. Her eyes had the sharp perception of someone who had watched many people pass through life. "You are not used to quiet places like this," she said. Daniel smiled faintly. "No. City man." "Yes." The old woman nodded knowingly. "City people move too fast." Daniel did not disagree. For the next 2 days, Daniel remained in the village while a mechanic from Mbale was contacted to inspect the vehicle. During that time, something unusual happened. Daniel began helping with the small daily tasks around the house. It was not something anyone had asked him to do, but sitting idle felt strange to him. So he repaired a loose section of the fence surrounding the courtyard. He carried water containers from the well when Joy returned from the market. He even helped gather firewood from the nearby grove. The villagers noticed. At first, they were curious. Travelers rarely stayed in the village longer than a single night. But soon the curiosity faded. To most people, Daniel was simply another temporary visitor who had run into trouble on the road. No one suspected anything unusual, except perhaps Jaja Namusoke. She never asked Daniel direct questions about his life. But sometimes her eyes rested on him longer than necessary, as though measuring something invisible. One evening after Joy returned from the market, the three of them sat beneath the mango tree as the sun dipped low over the hills. The sky glowed orange and pink. Daniel watched Joy carefully slice vegetables for dinner. "You work every day at the market?" he asked. Joy nodded. "Most days. Is it enough to live on?" She smiled softly. "Enough to survive." Daniel looked thoughtful. "Do you ever think about leaving the village?" Joy paused briefly before answering. "Sometimes, but my grandmother needs me here." Jaja Namusoke waved her hand dismissively. "I am old," she said. "Old people do not need much." Joy shook her head. "You say that, but you still refuse to rest." The old woman laughed quietly. Daniel listened to their exchange with a strange warmth growing inside his chest. The relationship between them was simple but strong. Something about it reminded him of a life he had rarely experienced. A life where people valued each other not because of power or status, but because they simply belonged together. Later that evening after dinner, Joy stepped outside to rinse the cooking pots. Daniel followed her. The night sky above the village was clear. Hundreds of stars shimmered across the darkness. You don't talk much about yourself, Joy said gently as she poured water over the dishes. Daniel leaned against the wooden post beside the house. There isn't much to say. Joy glanced at him with a small smile. People who say that usually have the most complicated stories. Daniel chuckled quietly. You may be right. Joy set the pot aside and wiped her hands. You don't have to tell me anything, she added. I know. They stood there in silence for a moment. The soft sounds of insects filled the air. Then Daniel spoke again. Why did you help me that day in the rain? Joy looked at him with mild surprise. Because you needed help. That's all. She nodded. Yes. Daniel studied her face carefully. You didn't worry I might be dangerous. Joy shrugged. You look tired, not dangerous. Daniel laughed softly. Your instincts are optimistic. Joy smiled. My grandmother says kindness is rarely wasted. Daniel turned his gaze back toward the stars. He had met many people in his life. Powerful people, influential people, people who pretended kindness while calculating profit. But Joy Nabiria's kindness felt different. It was simple, uncomplicated, and completely genuine. Something about that unsettled him, because Daniel knew something Joy did not. He knew that his presence in the village was not an accident of fate alone, and the life waiting for him beyond those hills was far more complicated than she could imagine. Yet standing there beneath the quiet sky beside her, Daniel felt something he had not experienced in years. Peace. The kind of peace that made him forget deadlines, board meetings, and the constant battles for control that defined his world. After a moment, he spoke quietly. Joy. She looked up. Yes, I'm glad my car broke down. She raised an eyebrow. That's a strange thing to be grateful for. Maybe, Daniel said. But if it hadn't happened. He stopped. Joy tilted her head slightly. If it hadn't happened, what? Daniel smiled faintly. I wouldn't have met you. Joy's cheeks warmed slightly in the darkness. For the first time since he arrived, something deeper passed between them, something neither of them named out loud, but both of them felt it. And neither of them realized that the quiet connection forming beneath that mango tree would soon grow into something powerful enough to change both their lives forever. Daniel Okello stayed longer than he had planned. At first, it was because of the car. The mechanic from Mbale had arrived 2 days after the storm, examined the vehicle carefully and scratched his head. The axle is bent, he had said. I will need parts from town. How long? Daniel asked. The mechanic shrugged. 3, maybe 4 days. Daniel had nodded calmly. Inside, however, he felt something unexpected. He was not in a hurry to leave. The quiet rhythm of life in Joy Nabiria's village had begun to settle into him, like a gentle tide. Each day followed a pattern that was simple, almost predictable, yet strangely comforting. In the mornings, Joy walked to the market with her basket balanced on her head. Daniel often accompanied her halfway down the dusty road, before turning back to help Jaja Namusoke with chores. Sometimes he repaired small things around the house. Sometimes he simply sat beneath the mango tree with the old woman listening to her stories of the village many years ago. And each evening, Joy returned from the market tired but smiling. Those evenings gradually became Daniel's favorite time of the day. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills, Joy sat beside him beneath the mango tree. The warm orange light painted the fields in soft gold. You are becoming part of the village, Joy teased lightly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. How so? People greet you now, she said. That means they have accepted you. Daniel chuckled. That is good news. Joy leaned back against the tree trunk. You will probably leave soon, though. The words were spoken casually, but Daniel noticed something in her voice. A quiet sadness she tried to hide. My car will be ready tomorrow, he said slowly. Joy nodded. That is good. But she did not look at him. The silence between them stretched longer than usual. Daniel studied the horizon for a moment before speaking again. Joy, may I ask you something? Of course. What do you want from life? The question seemed to surprise her. Joy thought for a moment before answering. I don't think about big things, she said. Just peace. Peace. She nodded. A small house, a family, work that feeds us. Daniel looked at her carefully. Nothing more. Joy smiled softly. More things bring more problems. Daniel laughed quietly. That is very wise. The sky slowly darkened as night approached. Crickets began singing in the grass. Joy wrapped her shawl around her shoulders against the cool air. Then she said something that made Daniel's chest tighten. City people probably dream of bigger things. Daniel looked down at his hands. Yes, he said quietly. And sometimes those dreams become heavy. Joy turned toward him. You carry something heavy, she said. It was not a question. Daniel looked surprised. Why do you think that? Joy shrugged gently. You look peaceful here, but also like someone who knows he cannot stay. Daniel exhaled slowly. She had understood more than he expected. He wanted to tell her everything in that moment. About the business empire waiting for him in Kampala. About the powerful family whose expectations weighed on his shoulders. About the endless battles for control and influence that had defined his life since childhood. But he stopped himself, because once the truth entered the space between them, everything would change. And Daniel realized he was not ready for that change. Not yet. Instead, he said quietly, You are very perceptive, Joy. She smiled faintly. Growing up in a village teaches you to read people. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel said softly, There is something else I want to tell you. Joy turned toward him again. Yes, I didn't come here by accident. Joy's brow furrowed slightly. What do you mean? Daniel hesitated. The truth sat heavy on his tongue. But before he could speak, Jaja Namasoke called from inside the house. Joy, come help me with the cooking. Joy stood up. I should go. Daniel nodded. Yes. She paused briefly before walking toward the house. Whatever you wanted to say, she added softly. You can tell me tomorrow. Daniel watched her disappear through the doorway. Tomorrow. The word echoed in his mind. But tomorrow arrived with something neither of them expected. Early the next morning, Daniel's phone, silent for days due to poor signal, finally caught a strong connection as he walked near the hill outside the village. The device vibrated violently in his hand. Multiple missed calls, dozens of messages. His face tightened as he read them. Most were from Kampala, from his company, from people who rarely contacted him unless something serious had happened. Then the phone rang again. Daniel answered. Daniel, a familiar voice said, urgently. It was his father's longtime advisor. You must return immediately. What happened? There is trouble with the company board, the man said. Your father collapsed yesterday during a meeting. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Is he alive? Yes. But the situation is unstable. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. I understand. You need to come back to Kampala today. The call ended. Daniel stood there on the hillside, staring down at the quiet village below. Joy's house was visible between the trees. Smoke drifted gently from the cooking fire. Everything looked peaceful, normal, and suddenly fragile. Because Daniel knew something now, he could not stay. When he returned to the house, Joy was preparing to leave for the market. You're back early, she said. Daniel forced a small smile. I need to leave today. Joy froze. So soon there is an emergency in Kampala. Joy nodded slowly. She tried to keep her expression calm. I understand. Daniel stepped closer. Joy, there are things I should have told you. She looked at him quietly. Then tell me. Daniel opened his mouth, but the words tangled in his throat. Everything felt too complicated to explain in a few rushed sentences. Instead, he reached for her hands. "I will come back," he said. Joy searched his face carefully. "Promise, I promise." The moment between them deepened. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Daniel leaned forward and kissed her gently. It was not rushed, not careless. It was a promise. Joy's heart raced, but she did not pull away. Later that morning, Daniel left the village. The repaired car rolled slowly down the dusty road between the hills. Joy stood beside the mango tree, watching until the vehicle disappeared. She believed him. She believed his promise. But weeks would pass, then months, and Daniel Okello would not return. Not yet, and by the time Joy Nibiria realized she was carrying his child, the village would already be preparing to judge her. At first, Joy Nibiria told no one, not even Jaja Namusoki. The realization came quietly one early morning as Joy prepared to leave for the market. She had woken before dawn as she always did, but something inside her body felt different. A strange heaviness, a faint wave of nausea. At first she thought it was simply exhaustion from the long weeks of work, but as the days passed, the feeling did not disappear. Instead, it grew stronger. One afternoon, while walking home along the dusty road, Joy stopped suddenly beside the cassava field. Her hand moved slowly to her stomach. Her heart began to beat faster. Because deep inside, she already knew the truth. The memory of Daniel's last night in the village returned to her like a whisper. The quiet promise in his eyes, the warmth of his arms, and suddenly, everything made sense. Joy sat down on a large stone beside the road. The wind moved gently through the tall grass. She closed her eyes. "Daniel," she whispered softly. For a long moment she simply sat there, holding her stomach with both hands. Joy was not frightened of motherhood. What frightened her was something else. The village. Life in a rural community had always been close-knit. But that closeness also meant that nothing remained secret for long. And in villages like theirs, an unmarried pregnant woman did not simply face curiosity. She faced judgment. Joy had seen it before. She knew how quickly kindness could turn into cruelty. Still, she did not tell anyone immediately. Instead, she continued living as though nothing had changed. Each morning she walked to the market. Each evening she returned home. She waited for Daniel. Surely he would come back soon. He had promised. Weeks passed, then another month. No message, no letter, no sign of him on the dusty road. Joy tried to remain hopeful. Perhaps something had delayed him in the city. Perhaps he had lost contact with the village, but hope slowly began to feel fragile. One evening while preparing dinner, Jaja Namusoke noticed something unusual. "Joy," the old woman said gently. Joy looked up from the cooking pot. "Yes, Jaja, you are eating less these days." Joy forced a small smile. "I'm just tired." But Jaja Namusoke's eyes were sharp. Old age had not dulled her instincts. The old woman watched her granddaughter carefully for several days. Then one morning, she spoke again. "You should tell me the truth," she said softly. Joy froze. "What truth?" Jaja Namusoke reached out and placed a hand on Joy's arm. "You are with child." Joy's breath caught. For a moment she could not speak. Then slowly she lowered her gaze. "Yes," she whispered. The old woman did not react with anger. Instead she sighed quietly. "Does the father know?" Joy shook her head. "He left before I knew, and he promised to return." Joy nodded again. Jaja Namusoke looked toward the distant hills. Her voice remained calm, but her expression carried deep concern. "Then we must pray. He keeps his promise." Joy felt tears sting her eyes. "I believe he will." The old woman squeezed her hand gently. "I hope you are right." For a short time, the secret remained inside the small house. But secrets rarely survive long in villages, especially when the human body begins to change. The first whispers began at the water well. Two women filling their jerry cans noticed Joy moving more slowly than usual. "She looks different," one of them murmured. "Maybe she is sick." A week later, another woman at the market noticed Joy resting more often. "Joy, are you feeling well?" she asked loudly. "I'm fine," Joy replied, but the woman's eyes had already moved to Joy's stomach. That was enough. Within days, the whispers spread like dry grass catching fire, at the market, at the church, at the small bar near the trading center. "Joy, Nibiria, is pregnant." "Who is the father?" "No one knows. I heard it was a traveler. A traveler. That sounds like a lie." The gossip grew louder with every retelling. Soon people were no longer whispering. They were talking openly. Joy felt the change immediately. Customers who once greeted her warmly now approached her stall with cautious curiosity. Some women shook their heads as they walked past. Young men whispered and laughed when they thought she could not hear. One afternoon, a group of girls standing near the fruit stall began giggling loudly as Joy passed. "Look," one of them said. She thought she could hide it. Joy kept walking. She did not respond, but inside her chest felt tight. The humiliation grew worse with each passing week. Even the church women who had once praised Joy for her kindness began avoiding her. One Sunday when Joy arrived for service, the space beside her remained empty. No one sat next to her. The message was clear. The village had begun to judge. The first open insult came at the market. Joy was arranging tomatoes on her small wooden table when a woman named Mama Birungi, known for her sharp tongue, stopped in front of her stall. Mama Birungi folded her arms and stared directly at Joy's stomach. "So it is true," she said loudly. Joy remained silent. The woman's voice rose so others could hear. "You walk around pretending to be a good girl, yet you cannot even name the father of your child." Several nearby traders turned their heads. Joy felt every pair of eyes on her, but she did not answer. Mama Birungi snorted. "Shame," she muttered before walking away. That evening, Joy returned home more exhausted than usual. She sat quietly beneath the mango tree, while the sun disappeared behind the hills. Jaja Namusoke joined her. "You must be strong," the old woman said gently. Joy nodded. "I will." But deep inside, Joy understood something painful. The whispers had only begun, and the village had not yet shown the full weight of its judgment. Because soon, the elders themselves would become involved. And when that happened, Joy Nibiria's quiet struggle would no longer remain private. It would become a public spectacle. The whispers that had once followed Joy Nibiria quietly through the market soon grew into something far louder. In a village, gossip rarely stays small for long. Every retelling adds a little more judgment, a little more certainty, until rumor slowly transforms into something people treat as fact. Within weeks, nearly everyone in the community believed they understood Joy's story, and most of them believed the worst version of it. At the water well, women shook their heads when her name was mentioned. At the trading center, men spoke about her with amused disappointment. Even children had begun repeating what they heard from adults. The girl with no husband. The girl who shamed the village. Joy continued walking through these places every day. But the air around her had changed. Greetings had disappeared. Smiles had faded. Where there had once been familiarity, there was now distance. Sometimes silence. Sometimes laughter. Yet Joy still held on to hope. Daniel had promised he would return, and until that promise was proven false, she refused to believe the worst about him. Every evening after returning from the market, Joy sat beneath the mango tree beside her home. Her eyes often drifted toward the dusty road that disappeared between the hills. Perhaps today, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps the sound of a car engine would appear on that road. But the road remained empty. Meanwhile, the pressure inside the village continued to grow. One afternoon, a group of women gathered near the well began speaking loudly enough for others to hear. "This cannot continue," one of them said. Young girls are watching. Another nodded. If we allow such behavior, our daughters will think it is acceptable. Their conversation reached the ears of Mama Barungi, the same woman who had insulted Joy in the market. Mama Barungi had always enjoyed influence in the village. She believed strongly in maintaining strict social rules and even more strongly in being the one who enforced them. Within days, she visited the home of Mozi Kato, the village elder. Mozi Kato was an older man with a long gray beard and a reputation for discipline. His authority in the community was rarely questioned. Mama Barungi wasted no time. "That girl Joy Nabiria is bringing disgrace to our village," she said bluntly. Mozi Kato listened quietly. "She walks around pregnant without a husband. Children are asking questions." He leaned back slowly in his wooden chair. "And what do you suggest?" Mama Barungi crossed her arms. "The elders must deal with this matter." Mozi Kato said nothing for a moment. The role of elder was not simple. A village depended on its traditions to maintain order, but those traditions could also become cruel when applied without compassion. Still, the pressure from the community was real. "Call a meeting," Mama Barungi continued. "Let her explain herself before the elders." The decision was made that same evening. Word spread quickly. A gathering would take place in the village square the following week. Joy Nabiria would be summoned to answer questions. When the message reached Joy's home, Jaja Namusoke's face tightened with concern. "This will not be easy," the old woman said quietly. Joy sat beside her inside the small house. "I know. Will you tell them the truth?" "Yes. Will they believe you?" Joy hesitated. "I don't know." The old woman reached for Joy's hand. "What matters is that you do not lie." Joy nodded. The days leading up to the meeting felt heavy. When Joy walked through the market, people spoke about the coming gathering openly. She will have to name the father. What if she refuses? Then the elders must decide. Joy tried not to listen. She focused on her work, focused on breathing, focused on the quiet strength Jaja Namusoke had always taught her. The morning of the meeting arrived under a bright sky. Villagers gathered in the square earlier than usual. Some came out of curiosity. Others came out of moral conviction, but many came simply because they wanted to witness the spectacle. Joy walked slowly toward the square with Jaja Namusoke beside her. Her pregnancy was now visible beneath her loose dress. As she approached, the murmuring crowd fell into uneasy silence. At the center of the square, Mozi Kato sat on a wooden chair with several other elders standing beside him. Joy stopped a few steps away. Her heart beat heavily in her chest. Mozi Kato raised his staff slightly. "Joy Nabiria," he said. His voice carried across the crowd. "You have been called here because the village seeks truth." Joy lowered her head respectfully. "I am here." The elder studied her carefully. "You carry a child." "Yes. Who is the father?" Joy lifted her eyes. "A man named Daniel." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Where is he?" "He left for Kampala," Joy said. "He promised to return." The murmuring grew louder. One of the elders frowned. "You expect us to believe that a man came to this village, made you pregnant, and simply disappeared?" Joy swallowed. "He had urgent business." "And he left you alone?" "Yes." Mama Barungi stepped forward from the crowd. "Do you even know his family?" she demanded. "No." "Do you know where he lives?" "No." The woman threw her hands up dramatically. "Then how can we believe he exists?" Laughter erupted from several people. Joy felt heat rise in her face, but she refused to look away. "I am telling the truth," she said quietly. Mozi Kato raised his hand to quiet the crowd. "If the father cannot be found," he said slowly, "then this situation becomes the responsibility of the village." He paused. "In our tradition, a child must have a father known to the community." Joy's voice trembled slightly. "He will come back." But even as she said the words, the confidence behind them felt fragile. The elders exchanged glances. Finally, Mozi Kato spoke again. "For now we will wait. Relief briefly washed through Joy, but the elder continued. However, if this man does not appear before the child is born, the village must decide what to do. The meaning behind his words hung heavily in the air. Joy understood. If Daniel did not return soon, the next meeting would not be about questions. It would be about punishment. And the village's patience was already beginning to run out. While the villagers of Mbale argued over Joy Nabiria's fate, the man whose name she defended with such quiet certainty was living in a world that looked nothing like the one she knew. Hundreds of kilometers away in the heart of Kampala, Daniel Okello stood inside a glass-walled office, overlooking the restless traffic of the city. The skyline stretched far into the distance. Tall office buildings, construction cranes, and highways crowded with cars. Inside the office, however, the air felt far heavier than the busy streets below. A long conference table sat in the center of the room. Around it were seated several powerful men and women in expensive suits. They were members of the Okello Holdings board, and they were arguing. "This is unacceptable," one man said sharply. "If the company appears unstable, our international investors will withdraw immediately." Another executive leaned forward. "The chairman's health is declining. The market already senses weakness." At the head of the table sat Daniel Okello. He listened silently, his hands folded together. The company they were discussing was not small. Okello Holdings controlled shipping routes, construction contracts, and transportation networks across several East African countries. It had been built by Daniel's father, Samuel Okello, over nearly 4 decades. Samuel had risen from poverty in northern Uganda to become one of the most powerful business figures in the region, and now, that empire was under threat. 3 weeks earlier, Samuel Okello had collapsed during a board meeting. A stroke, he survived, but his ability to lead the company had weakened overnight, which meant one thing: the responsibility now fell on Daniel. The room continued buzzing with tension. Finally, Daniel spoke. His voice was calm but firm. "We are not selling any divisions." One of the board members, Patrick Okello, leaned forward. Patrick was Samuel's younger brother and Daniel's uncle. Daniel Patrick said smoothly, "You must understand the scale of this crisis." Daniel met his uncle's gaze evenly. "I understand it very well." Patrick's expression hardened slightly. "The board must consider stability." Daniel knew exactly what his uncle meant. Stability was the polite word. Control was the real objective. For years, Patrick had quietly waited for an opportunity to influence the company's direction. Now that Samuel was weakened, the opportunity had finally arrived, and Daniel was the obstacle standing in his way. Another voice joined the discussion. Grace Nakato, one of the most influential board members, spoke carefully. "There are ways to stabilize the company's image," she said. Daniel already knew what was coming. Grace continued. "A strong family alliance would reassure investors." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "A marriage alliance," he said flatly. Grace smiled politely. "Exactly." Patrick nodded. The Nakato family and the Okello family working together would strengthen both sides. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "You've already discussed this." Grace did not deny it. "My daughter Vanessa Nakato would make an excellent partner for you." The room fell silent. Daniel looked around the table. Several board members avoided his gaze. Others watched carefully, waiting for his response. Inside, Daniel's chest frustration tightened like a knot. This was the real reason his phone had been flooded with urgent messages. The real reason he had been pulled back to Kampala so suddenly. Not simply the company, but control over his future. Daniel exhaled slowly. "With respect," he said, "my personal life is not a business contract." Patrick's voice hardened. "This company feeds thousands of families." "And I am protecting it," Daniel replied calmly. "But I will not marry someone simply to satisfy investors." Grace's polite smile faded slightly. "You should think carefully," she said. Daniel stood up. I already have. Without waiting for further argument, he walked toward the window overlooking the city. Traffic lights blinked below like restless stars. Behind him, the board members continued discussing strategy. But Daniel's thoughts had drifted far away from the conference room, back to a small village near Mbale, back to a mango tree beside a mud brick house, back to Joy. The memory of her quiet smile returned with painful clarity. Daniel had planned to return to her within days. That had been his promise. But once he arrived in Kampala, everything collapsed into chaos. Board meetings, legal documents, security concerns, phone calls that never stopped, and something else, something more troubling. Daniel had begun noticing strange interference. Calls that disappeared, messages that never delivered. When he tried to contact the village through the mechanic who had repaired his car, the number suddenly stopped working. At first, he assumed it was coincidence. But now, standing in his office after the meeting ended, Daniel felt a growing suspicion. Someone had deliberately cut off those connections. Someone inside the company. He turned away from the window. Patrick was still seated at the table watching him. The older man's expression carried a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. "You should consider our proposal carefully," Patrick said. Daniel said nothing, but inside his mind a realization was forming. If his uncle was willing to manipulate the board, manipulate investors, and manipulate the media, then cutting off contact with a remote village would be a very small step. Later that night, Daniel sat alone in his apartment. The city lights flickered beyond the glass walls. He held his phone in his hand, scrolling through the contact list. Joy's number was not there. He had never taken it. In the quiet simplicity of the village, it had not seemed necessary. He had assumed he would simply return. The realization now felt painfully foolish. Daniel placed the phone down slowly. "I will fix this," he murmured to himself. But he knew something now. Returning to Joy would not be simple, because the battle for control of Okello Holdings had only just begun, and powerful people were already trying to control every move he made. Meanwhile, far away in Mbale, Joy Nibiria was facing a very different kind of battle. A battle not fought in boardrooms, but in the unforgiving court of public judgment, and neither of them knew how dangerously close those two worlds were about to collide. While Daniel Okello struggled against invisible enemies in the glass towers of Kampala, Joy Nibiria was fighting a battle far more visible and far more personal. The villagers no longer bothered to whisper. Their judgment had grown bold. Every step Joy took through the market now felt like walking through a storm of eyes. Some were curious, some were amused, some were openly cruel. Yet Joy still woke before sunrise every morning. The routine had become her anchor. Before the first light touched the hills, she swept the courtyard outside the small mud brick house she shared with Jaja Namusoke. Then she prepared tea-boiled cassava for breakfast and packed the vegetables she would sell that day. The work had not become easier. In fact, it had become harder. Her pregnancy was now clearly visible beneath her dress. Walking the long road to the market required more effort each week. But Joy refused to stop. One morning, as she adjusted the basket on her head, Jaja Namusoke watched her carefully. "You should rest more," the old woman said gently. Joy smiled. "If I rest, who will buy medicine for you when your joints ache?" The old woman shook her head softly. "You worry too much about me." Joy stepped closer and kissed her grandmother's cheek. "And you worry too much about me." They both laughed quietly, but the laughter faded when Joy stepped onto the dusty road toward the market. Because once she left the safety of their small home, the world outside felt colder. That morning, the market was already crowded when she arrived. The air smelled of roasted maize and fried cassava. Traders called out loudly, advertising their goods. But when Joy approached her usual spot beside the tomato seller, the woman who normally shared the space with her moved her basket slightly farther away. The gesture was subtle, But Joy noticed. She said nothing. Instead, she quietly arranged her vegetables on the wooden table. For a while, business continued normally. A few customers still approached her stall, but others deliberately avoided it. One woman whispered loudly enough for Joy to hear, "I cannot buy from someone who has brought shame to herself." Another customer shook her head. "Young girls are watching. We must set an example." Joy kept her eyes lowered as she counted the small coins a buyer handed her. She did not argue. Arguing would not change their minds. By midday, the heat had grown intense. Joy wiped sweat from her forehead and leaned briefly against the table. Her back ached, her feet were swollen, and the baby inside her shifted gently, reminding her that she was no longer carrying only her own burdens. Across the market, Mama Barungi stood with a group of women watching her. Their conversation grew louder. "Look how she still pretends nothing is wrong," Mama Barungi said. One of the women laughed. "Perhaps she thinks the father will return with money." The group erupted in mocking laughter. Joy heard every word. Her hands tightened around the edge of the table. For a moment, the humiliation felt overwhelming. But then she placed her hand on her stomach. The small movement inside reminded her of something far more important than the voices around her. This child was innocent, and that meant Joy had to remain strong. Later that afternoon, something unexpected happened. A young mother approached her stall with a small boy holding her hand. The woman hesitated briefly before speaking. "How much for the tomatoes?" Joy looked up. 2,000 shillings. The woman nodded and handed her the money. As Joy placed the tomatoes into a small bag, the woman leaned closer. "People talk too much," she whispered quietly. Joy looked surprised. The woman gave a small smile. "Not everyone believes them." Then she walked away. The simple kindness warmed Joy's chest. It was the first supportive gesture she had received in weeks. Perhaps the entire village had not turned against her after all. When evening arrived, Joy packed the few vegetables she had not sold and began the long walk home. The sky above the hills glowed deep orange as the sun prepared to set. Halfway down the road, she stopped to rest beside a large rock. The baby kicked gently. Joy placed both hands on her stomach. "I know," she whispered softly. "I'm tired too." But then she looked toward the road, leading to the highway. The same road where Daniel had once arrived. The same road where he had promised he would return. Her heart still believed in that promise, even when doubt tried to creep in, even when the village mocked her, even when the nights grew longer and lonelier. Joy whispered quietly into the evening air, "You will come back." But somewhere deep inside, another voice had begun asking a painful question. What if he never does? Joy closed her eyes briefly. Then she stood up again. Because whether Daniel returned or not, life continued, and tomorrow morning, she would still rise before the sun. She would still carry her basket to the market. She would still protect the child growing inside her. The village could judge her. The world could whisper about her. But Joy Nibiria had already made a decision. She would not break, even if she had to stand alone. In Kampala, life moved at a speed that rarely allowed time for reflection. Traffic roared along Jinja Road from early morning until deep into the night. Construction cranes hovered above half-finished towers, and businessmen rushed from meeting to meeting as though the entire city ran on urgency. For Daniel Okello, the days had become a blur of decisions, arguments, and sleepless nights. Since his father's collapse, the weight of Okello Holdings had fallen squarely onto his shoulders. What had once been a company, led by a powerful patriarch, had suddenly become a battlefield. And Daniel now stood at the center of it. Inside the main headquarters building, the boardroom lights often remained on long after sunset. That evening was no different. Stacks of documents lay spread across the long polished table: contracts, financial reports, legal assessments. Daniel rubbed his temples as he studied the latest report. Across the table sat Ms. Lydia Otwine, the company's legal advisor. "You should get some rest," she said carefully. Daniel shook his head. "Not yet." The woman hesitated before continuing. "There is something else you should know." Daniel looked up. "Yes, several board members have been contacting investors privately." Daniel's expression hardened. "Let me guess," he said. "My uncle." Lydia nodded. "Patrick Okello has been suggesting that the company needs different leadership." Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. "So, the knives are finally out in the open." For months, tensions inside the company had been building quietly beneath the surface. Patrick had always been ambitious, but while Samuel Okello remained strong, he never had the opportunity to challenge his older brother directly. Now that Samuel was weakened, Patrick saw his moment. "What about the Nakato family?" Daniel asked. Lydia's answer was cautious. "They are still pushing the marriage proposal." Daniel exhaled slowly. The idea of marrying Vanessa Nakato, a woman he barely knew purely for business stability, felt like a trap. But he understood the pressure behind it. A public alliance between the two families would calm investors overnight. It would stabilize the company's image. It would also place Daniel firmly under the influence of people who wanted control. And Daniel had no intention of surrendering his freedom that easily. After Lydia left the room, Daniel remained alone in the office. The city lights flickered outside the window. For a moment, he allowed himself to lean back and close his eyes. And when he did, the memory returned again. Joy Nibiria, the quiet girl beneath the mango tree, the warmth in her voice, the way she had looked at him. Not as a businessman, not as an heir, but simply as a man. Daniel opened his eyes and reached for his phone. He had been trying to reconnect with the village for weeks. At first, he had asked the mechanic who repaired his car. The mechanic claimed he had lost Joy's location. Then Daniel tried contacting the small trading center nearby. No one answered. Even the local transport driver who once knew the area had suddenly become unreachable. It felt too coincidental, and Daniel was no longer a man who believed in coincidences. Something had interfered with those connections. Someone had. He scrolled through his phone and stopped at a contact name. Joseph Kintu. Joseph had once been his father's most trusted driver. The man knew roads across half of Uganda, and he rarely asked unnecessary questions. Daniel pressed the call button. The phone rang twice. Mr. Daniel Joseph answered. Joseph Daniel said calmly, "Are you still in Kampala?" "Yes, sir. I need a favor." "Of course. There is a village near Mbale," Daniel said. "I want you to find it." Joseph hesitated briefly. "Is this personal?" "Yes." Daniel's voice carried quiet determination. "I need you to drive there tomorrow. And when I find it..." Daniel stood up and walked toward the window. "Tell me everything you see." Joseph agreed without further questions. After the call ended, Daniel felt something shift inside him. For weeks, he had allowed the chaos of the company to trap him. But now he realized something important. If he did not take control of his own path, others would continue deciding it for him. That included his uncle. That included the board. And that included the future they were trying to force upon him. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers away, the quiet village near Mbale was moving toward another turning point. The elders had waited. They had given Joy Nibiria time, but patience inside a tight-knit community rarely lasted forever. One evening as the sun began to set, Maziketo sat outside his house with several other elders. Mama Birungi stood nearby speaking with sharp frustration. "How long must we wait?" she demanded. "That girl grows larger every week." The men exchanged glances. "We already held one meeting," another elder said, "and she promised the father would return." Mama Birungi scoffed loudly. "Promises are easy, but shame spreads quickly." Several villagers standing nearby nodded in agreement. Mazikato leaned forward slowly. His voice was calm but firm. "If the man does not return soon," he said, "the village must make a decision." Mama Birungi's eyes narrowed. That decision should happen now. The elder remained silent for a moment. Then he nodded. Call another gathering. Word spread quickly once again. Another meeting would be held in the village square, and this time the discussion would be far more serious. Because Joy Nibiria was no longer just a young woman with a secret. She was a symbol of something the village believed must be corrected. And when the day of that meeting arrived, the humiliation Joy faced would be greater than anything she had experienced before. But neither the villagers nor the elders knew something important. Far away on the highway leading toward Mbale, a car had already begun, driving in their direction. The morning of the second village gathering arrived with a heavy stillness in the air. Even before the sun fully rose above the hills near Mbale, people were already whispering about the meeting that would take place later that day. Word had spread quickly, the evening before Joy Nibiria would once again stand before the elders. But this time the tone of the gathering would be different. The first meeting had been about questions. This one would be about consequences. Joy knew it the moment she stepped outside her small house. The sky was pale gray with early morning light, and the air carried the quiet tension that comes before something important. She stood for a moment in the courtyard, her hand resting gently on her swollen belly. Inside the house, Jaja Namusoke watched her from the doorway. "You should eat something before we go," the old woman said softly. Joy shook her head. "I don't think I can." Jaja Namusoke stepped closer, her wrinkled hands reaching for Joy's. "You must keep your strength," she insisted. "Not for them, for the child." Joy forced herself to swallow a small piece of cassava and drink tea, though her stomach twisted with anxiety. The baby shifted again inside her, a small movement that reminded her she was no longer facing the village alone. Still, the weight of the coming meeting pressed heavily on her chest. By mid-morning, villagers had already begun gathering in the square near the trading center. Women stood in clusters whispering to each other. Men leaned against bicycles and wooden stalls, waiting with quiet anticipation. Children ran between the adults, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it. At the center of the square stood the wooden chair where Mimzi Kato would sit. Beside it were several stools for the other elders. Mama Birungi stood near the front of the crowd, arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the road leading toward Joy's home. "She is late," she muttered loudly. "She will come," another woman replied. And then, as if summoned by the words themselves, Joy appeared at the edge of the square. She walked slowly, one hand supporting her lower back. Jaja Namusoke walked beside her. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some villagers stared openly at Joy's stomach. Others shook their heads with quiet disapproval. Joy kept her eyes forward. She refused to let them see the fear rising inside her. When she reached the center of the square, Mimzi Kato raised his staff gently. The crowd fell silent. Joy Nibiria, the elder, said, his voice carrying across the square. "You were given time." Joy lowered her head respectfully. "Yes, you promised the father of your child would return. I believed he would." Mimzi Kato studied her carefully. "But he has not." Joy's heart pounded. "No." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Mama Birungi stepped forward again. "We cannot allow this disgrace to continue," she declared. "She refuses to name the father properly. She expects us to believe a man who disappeared will come back like a hero." Several villagers nodded. Joy felt heat rising in her face. "I told you his name," she said quietly. "Daniel," Mama Birungi scoffed. "A name without proof means nothing." One of the elders spoke next. "You do not know his family. No. You do not know his home. No. Then how can the village accept your story?" Joy swallowed hard. "I am telling the truth." The elder sighed. "Truth without evidence is difficult to defend." The crowd murmured again. A young man near the back laughed loudly. "Maybe the father is imaginary." More laughter followed. Joy felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to cry. Mimzi Kato raised his staff again to quiet the noise. Our traditions exist to protect the community, he said slowly. When a child is born without a known father, it creates confusion and shame. He paused before continuing. You were warned during the first meeting. Joy's voice trembled slightly. I asked only for time. You were given time, the elder replied, and now the time has passed. The meaning behind his words felt like a heavy stone dropping into Joy's chest. What does that mean? She asked softly. Mnzi Kato looked toward the other elders. After a brief exchange of glances, he spoke again. If the father cannot be found, the entire square held its breath. Then you cannot remain here. The words struck Joy like a physical blow. For a moment, she could not breathe. Jaja Namasoke stepped forward weakly. You cannot send her away, the old woman pleaded. She is carrying a child, Mama Birungi's voice cut through the air. That is exactly the problem. A wave of anger spread through Joy's chest. I have done nothing wrong, she said. You broke our traditions, Mama Birungi snapped. I loved someone, Joy replied. The crowd erupted into louder whispers. Mnzi Kato raised his voice again. The decision stands. He pointed toward the road, leading away from the village. You must leave before the child is born. Joy's world seemed to spin. Leave. The word echoed in her mind. This was the only home she had ever known. The place where her parents were buried. The place where Jaja Namusoki had raised her. And now they were telling her to walk away. The baby shifted again inside her. Joy lifted her chin slowly. I will not leave, she said. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mama Birungi's eyes flashed with anger. You do not get to refuse. But Joy stood still. If Daniel returns, she said quietly, you will know I told the truth. Mama Birungi laughed coldly. That man will never come back. Joy felt her chest tighten, but before she could answer, a sound broke through the crowd. Low at first, then louder, the deep rumble of engines. Several villagers turned toward the dusty road. 3 black vehicles appeared in the distance, moving slowly toward the square. Confusion spread through the crowd. No one in the village owned vehicles like those. The engines grew louder as the SUVs rolled closer, and then one by one the doors opened. Men in dark suits stepped out. The entire square fell into stunned silence. Finally, from the front vehicle, one more man stepped onto the road. Tall, confident, and staring directly toward Joy Nibiria. For several long seconds, no one in the village square moved. The deep rumble of the SUV's engines faded into silence as the vehicles came to a complete stop along the dusty road. The contrast was striking. The village square was made of packed red earth surrounded by wooden stalls and small mud brick houses. The vehicles that had just arrived were sleek black machines polished so perfectly that the sunlight reflected sharply off their surfaces. Villagers stared in disbelief. Whispers began rippling through the crowd. Who are they, government officials? Police. Mama Birungi frowned clearly, irritated that the meeting she had pushed for was suddenly being interrupted. Mnzi Kato narrowed his eyes toward the road. From the first SUV, 2 men stepped out wearing dark suits and sunglasses. They moved with quiet professionalism, scanning the area before opening the rear door of the vehicle. Then the third man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a simple but elegant charcoal suit. His shoes were polished, his posture confident. But it was not his appearance that froze Joy Nibiria in place. It was his face. For a moment, her mind refused to believe what her eyes were seeing. Her heart began to pound so loudly she could barely hear the murmurs around her. Daniel! The word escaped her lips as little more than a breath. The man walking toward the square lifted his eyes. And the moment he saw her, he stopped. Everything else around them seemed to fade. The crowd, the whispers, the elders sitting in judgment. All of it disappeared into the background. For Daniel Okello, there was only joy. and the unmistakable curve of the child she carried. His chest tightened. Weeks of searching, weeks of frustration, weeks of fearing he might already be too late. And now, she stood right in front of him. But something about the scene was wrong. Very wrong. He noticed the crowd surrounding her, the elders seated in judgment, the tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Daniel's jaw tightened. He resumed walking. Behind him, 2 members of his security team followed at a respectful distance. The villagers stepped aside automatically as he approached. His presence carried a quiet authority that no one could ignore. Mama Birungi's voice broke the stunned silence. "Who are you?" she demanded sharply. Daniel did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Joy. Only when he reached the center of the square did he finally speak. "My name," he said calmly, "is Daniel Okello." A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Some villagers exchanged puzzled glances. The name meant little to them, but others, especially the elders who occasionally traveled to Mbale, felt a flicker of recognition. Mzee Kato leaned forward slightly. "Daniel Okello," he repeated slowly. Daniel nodded. "Yes." Mama Birungi scoffed impatiently. "And why have you come here interrupting our meeting?" Daniel turned his gaze toward her for the first time. His expression remained calm, but there was steel behind his eyes. "I came," he said quietly, "because you are discussing the future of my child." The words landed like thunder. Gasps erupted across the square. Mama Birungi blinked. What Daniel turned back toward Joy. He stepped closer, his voice softer now. "I'm sorry," he said. Joy felt tears fill her eyes. "You came back," she whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. "I told you I would." Then without hesitation, Daniel did something that shocked the entire village. He dropped to one knee in front of her. The movement was deliberate, respectful, and completely unexpected. Joy stared at him in disbelief. "Daniel?" His eyes moved gently to her stomach. For a moment, the powerful businessman from Kampala disappeared. In his place stood a man filled with regret. "I should have come sooner," he said quietly. "But I promise you, I am here now." Behind him, the villagers watched in stunned silence. Mzee Kato slowly stood up from his chair. "Is this true?" the elder asked. Daniel rose to his feet again and turned toward the elders. "Yes," he said firmly. "The child Joy carries is mine." Mama Birungi's mouth fell open. "But you are just a traveler." One of the men standing near the SUVs stepped forward. He held a small folder. "Allow me to clarify," the man said politely. "My name is Mr. Kintu, and I represent Okello Holdings." Several villagers looked confused, but the elders understood. Okello Holdings was one of the most powerful companies in Uganda. Mr. Kintu continued. "Mr. Daniel Okello is the current executive director of the company." The square exploded into shocked murmurs. A company director from Kampala, Mama Birungi, looked suddenly pale. "You mean he is rich?" Daniel did not respond to the comment. Instead, he faced the elders again. "I believe there was discussion about forcing Joy to leave the village." Mzee Kato cleared his throat awkwardly. "That was before we understood the situation." Daniel's voice remained calm. "The situation," he said quietly, "is very simple." He gestured toward Joy. "This woman helped me when I was injured and alone. She gave me shelter without asking for anything in return, and now she carries my child." His gaze hardened slightly. "No one will send her away." Silence spread across the square. The authority in his voice was unmistakable. Mama Birungi tried to recover her composure. "Well, if that is true, then perhaps things are different." Daniel looked at her sharply. "Different," he repeated. The woman hesitated. "Of course," she said quickly. "If you are truly the father, then the village welcomes." Daniel cut her off. "Interesting." His voice was still calm. "But a few minutes ago, You were calling her a disgrace." Mama Birungi's face flushed red. Several villagers lowered their eyes uncomfortably. Daniel turned back toward Joy. The anger in his expression softened. "You should never have faced this alone," he said. Joy felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "I believed you would come back," she whispered. Daniel reached out and gently took her hand. And in that moment, the entire village realized something they had never expected. The quiet girl they had mocked was no longer standing alone. The silence in the village square lingered long after Daniel Okello took Joy Nabiria's hand. It was the kind of silence that comes when people suddenly realize they have misjudged something and that their mistake cannot easily be undone. Moments earlier, many of those same villagers had been ready to cast Joy out of the only home she had ever known. Now the man they had dismissed as an imaginary father stood in front of them, not only real, but powerful. The whispers returned quickly. "Did he say? Okello Holdings, that company owns half the trucks in Kampala. He must be extremely rich." Mama Birungi's face had lost its earlier confidence. She forced a stiff smile, glancing nervously between Daniel and the elders. "Well," she said awkwardly, "it seems we misunderstood the situation." Daniel did not respond. Instead, he guided Joy gently to the wooden bench beneath the large acacia tree near the center of the square. "You should sit," he said quietly. Joy nodded. Her legs still felt weak from the emotional shock of seeing him again. As she lowered herself onto the bench, Daniel remained beside her, his presence steady and protective. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The crowd waited. Finally, Joy looked up at him. Her eyes were still shining with tears. "You disappeared," she said softly. The words were not angry, but they carried months of pain. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "I know. You promised you would come back." "I did." Joy searched his face. "Then why didn't you?" The entire square listened. Daniel glanced briefly toward the elders and villagers surrounding them. This conversation, he realized, could not remain private anymore. He turned back to Joy. "The truth," he said quietly, "is complicated." Joy nodded slowly. "Then tell it." Daniel took a breath. "When I returned to Kampala, my father collapsed during a meeting. Several villagers exchanged surprised looks. The company nearly fell apart overnight," Daniel continued. "Board members fought for control. Contracts were threatened. Investors panicked." Joy listened carefully. "But that does not explain why you never contacted me," she said gently. Daniel hesitated. "Because someone made sure I couldn't." A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. "My uncle Daniel explained. Patrick Okello, while I was fighting to stabilize the company, he was quietly blocking my attempts to reach this village." Joy frowned. "Why?" "Because if I married someone chosen by the board, Daniel said they would gain influence over the company. And you refused." "Yes." Joy looked down briefly at her hands. The explanation made sense, but it did not erase the loneliness she had endured. Daniel noticed the hesitation in her expression. "I should have found another way," he admitted. "I should have come back sooner." The honesty in his voice softened something inside her. Yet the memory of the village's cruelty still lingered. "You know what they said about me," Joy whispered. Daniel glanced toward the villagers. His expression darkened slightly. "I can imagine. They called me a disgrace. They told me to leave before my child was born." Daniel's gaze shifted toward Mama Birungi. The woman suddenly looked very uncomfortable. "I am sorry," Daniel said quietly. "You should never have faced that alone." Joy wiped a tear from her cheek. "I kept believing you would return." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "And you were right." The villagers shifted uneasily. Many of them avoided looking directly at Joy. They had not expected the story to unfold this way. Finally, Mzee Kato cleared his throat. "Mr. Okello, the elder, said respectfully, if what you say is true, then perhaps we were too quick in our judgment." Daniel turned toward him. Perhaps. The elder lowered his gaze slightly. Our traditions exist to protect the community. I understand that, Danielle replied. But traditions should not punish the innocent. The words hung in the air. Several villagers nodded quietly. Mama Birungi attempted to recover her dignity. Well, she said quickly, now that everything is clear, we should celebrate the child's father returning. Daniel looked at her calmly. Celebration is not necessary. The woman blinked. What do you mean, I mean? Daniel said that respect should not depend on wealth. The crowd grew quiet again. Joy deserved kindness even when you believed she was poor. He continued, no woman should be humiliated for carrying a child. Mama Birungi's cheeks reddened. Some villagers shifted uncomfortably. Others looked ashamed. Joy watched Daniel carefully. His words surprised her, not because she disagreed, but because they revealed something deeper about the man she had trusted months ago. He was not defending her simply because he felt guilty. He was defending her because he believed in what was right. Still, something inside her remained unsettled. She stood slowly from the bench. Daniel, she said. Yes, I am glad you came back. He nodded. But that does not mean everything is the same. The square fell silent again. What do you mean? He asked quietly. Joy met his eyes. You left me here to face all of this alone. Daniel looked down briefly. I know. And trust does not return as quickly as a car driving down a road. Her voice was calm but firm. I need time. Daniel nodded slowly. That is fair, Joy continued. I will not run away with you just because you are rich. A few villagers gasped softly. Daniel almost smiled. That is exactly why I came back. Joy blinked in surprise. Well, because I knew you would say something like that. He stepped closer. I am not asking you to forgive everything today. What are you asking? Daniel looked toward the small house where she lived with Jaja Namasoke. I'm asking for the chance to prove I deserve to be part of your life. Joy's heart trembled. For the first time since he had arrived, hope and caution existed side by side inside her chest. But before she could answer, a sudden pain tightened across her stomach. Joy gasped. Her hand flew instinctively to her belly. Daniel's eyes widened. Joy. Another sharp wave of pain followed. Joy struggled to breathe. I think. Her voice trembled. I think the baby is coming. Joy Nabiria's breath caught sharply as the pain tightened across her stomach. For a moment she tried to steady herself, gripping the edge of the wooden bench beside her. But another wave followed quickly, stronger than the first. Her knees trembled. Daniel moved instantly. Joy, he said, his voice suddenly tense. What's wrong? She inhaled slowly, trying to control the pain. I think, she whispered. Another contraction cut through her words. The baby. Her hand pressed against her belly. It's coming! A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. Several women stepped closer immediately. Mama Birungi's expression shifted from embarrassment to alarm. It's too early, one of the older women said quickly. How far along is she? Jaja Namasoke hurried forward, her face pale. She still had weeks, the old woman said anxiously. Joy bent slightly, trying to breathe through the tightening pain. Daniel's heart began racing. He had faced hostile investors, ruthless competitors, and tense negotiations in corporate boardrooms. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment. What do we do? He asked. One of the village women answered firmly. She must go to the hospital in Mbale. That's more than 30 minutes away, another said. And the road is rough. Daniel turned toward his security team. Get the car ready, he ordered. Within seconds, the men were already moving. The rear door of the first SUV opened. But Joy's pain struck again before she could even stand. She gasped, clutching Daniel's arm. I can't walk, she whispered. Daniel immediately lifted her into his arms. The crowd parted as he carried her toward the waiting vehicle. Behind them, Jaja Namasoke hurried as fast as her old legs allowed. I'm coming, she called. Mama Barungi stood frozen in the square, watching the scene unfold. Moments earlier, she had been one of the loudest voices condemning Joy. Now the young woman she had judged was being carried toward an uncertain childbirth. A quiet guilt crept into the edges of her thoughts. Meanwhile, Daniel carefully placed Joy in the back seat of the SUV. "Drive," he told the driver. The engine roared to life. The vehicle sped down the dusty road toward Mbale. Inside the car, Joy's breathing grew uneven. Daniel sat beside her, gripping her hand tightly. "You're going to be okay," he said softly. Joy tried to smile through the pain. "You sound like you're convincing yourself." Daniel exhaled nervously. "I might be." Another contraction hit. Joy cried out. Daniel felt his chest tighten painfully. He had never felt so helpless. The driver pushed the vehicle faster along the rough road. Dust rose behind them in thick clouds. Behind the first SUV, the other two vehicles followed closely. Inside the hospital in Immobile, nurses rushed forward when the convoy arrived. The sudden appearance of 3 black SUVs outside the emergency entrance caught immediate attention. Daniel stepped out carrying Joy again. "She's in labor," he said urgently. The nurses guided them inside. Within minutes, Joy was placed on a hospital bed and rushed toward the maternity ward. Daniel tried to follow, but a nurse stopped him at the door. "You must wait here." The doors closed. Daniel stood in the hallway staring at them. Time suddenly felt very slow. Minutes stretched painfully. Jaja Namusoke arrived shortly after, supported by one of Daniel's security men. The old woman looked exhausted, but determined. "Is she inside?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "They won't let me in." Jaja Namusoke placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Childbirth is not a quiet battle," she said softly. "But women are stronger than we think." Daniel sat down heavily on the hospital bench. His mind raced with memories. Joy standing alone in the village square. Joy waiting beneath the mango tree. Joy believing in his promise when everyone else doubted it. And now, she was inside that room, fighting to bring their child into the world. Hours passed. Doctors and nurses moved in and out of the maternity ward. Each time the doors opened, Daniel stood up quickly, but the staff only shook their heads. Not yet. At one point, a doctor approached him. "You are the father, yes. She is very strong," the doctor said, "but the labor is difficult." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "Is she in danger?" The doctor hesitated briefly. "There are complications." The words landed like a heavy weight. Daniel ran his hands through his hair. "Do whatever you need to do," he said. "Just save her." The doctor nodded and returned to the ward. Jaja Namusoke sat quietly beside Daniel. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, the old woman broke the silence. "You truly care for her," she said. Daniel looked down. "I should have protected her sooner." Jaja Namusoke shook her head gently. "Life does not move according to our plans. But love is proven by what we do when things become difficult." Daniel nodded slowly. Another hour passed. Then suddenly the doors to the maternity ward opened again. This time the doctor walked toward them with a tired but relieved smile. "The baby is here." Daniel stood immediately. "And Joy?" The doctor nodded. "She is safe." Relief flooded through Daniel's chest so suddenly he nearly lost his balance. "A boy," the doctor added. Daniel felt something inside him shift. A son. His son. "Can we see them?" he asked. Soon the doctor said, "They are resting." As the doctor walked away, Daniel turned toward Jaja Namusoke. The old woman's eyes were shining with quiet tears. "Your child has arrived," she said softly. And in that moment, Daniel understood something deeply. The journey that had begun with a broken car on a rainy road had now become something far greater. A family. But the final chapter of Joy Nabiria's story was still waiting to unfold. Morning sunlight filtered softly through the hospital window as Joy Nibiria slowly opened her eyes. For a moment, she did not remember where she was. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar. The smell of disinfectant filled the room, and distant voices echoed faintly through the hallway. Then the memory returned. The village square, the confrontation, Daniel, and the sudden pain that had brought everything to a halt. Joy instinctively moved her hand toward her stomach. It felt different now, empty. A quiet panic flickered across her face. Before she could speak, a gentle voice beside her said softly, "He's right here." Joy turned her head. Daniel Okello was sitting beside the hospital bed. In his arms, wrapped carefully in a white blanket, was a tiny sleeping baby. Joy's breath caught. "Is he?" Daniel smiled gently. "He's healthy." Joy felt tears gather in her eyes. "Can I hold him?" Daniel carefully placed the baby into her arms. The moment the tiny weight settled against her chest, something deep inside Joy shifted. The months of fear, the humiliation, the loneliness, all of it faded beneath the overwhelming feeling of holding her child. The baby stirred slightly, his small fingers curling instinctively. Joy whispered softly, "Hello, little one." Daniel watched her quietly. In all the chaos of the past months, he had imagined many possible outcomes, but nothing compared to this quiet moment. After a while, Joy looked up. "What will we call him?" Daniel considered the question. Then he said softly, "Samuel." Joy's eyebrows lifted slightly. "After your father," Daniel nodded. "Yes." Joy smiled gently. "I think he would like that." A quiet knock sounded on the door. Jaja Namasoki entered slowly, supported by one of the nurses. The old woman's eyes filled with tears the moment she saw the baby. "My great-grandson," she whispered. Joy laughed softly. "Come meet him." Jaja Namasoki sat beside the bed and gently touched the baby's cheek. "Strong," she said proudly. "Just like his mother." Daniel smiled faintly. Later that afternoon, Daniel stepped outside the hospital building to make a call. His voice was calm, but firm. "I want a meeting with the board tomorrow," he told his assistant, "and prepare the legal documents I requested." "Yes, sir," the assistant replied. When the call ended, Daniel stood quietly for a moment. The events of the past weeks had changed something inside him. Power, money, corporate battles. They all still mattered. But now they mattered for a different reason. Because he had someone to protect. Two people. Inside the hospital room, Joy rested quietly while Samuel slept beside her. For the first time in months, her mind felt peaceful. Yet she knew life outside the hospital would still bring difficult decisions. The village, the whispers, the future. That evening, Daniel returned to the room. "Joy," he said gently. She looked up. "Yes, there's something we need to talk about." Joy nodded. "The village." Daniel sighed softly. "I know they hurt you." Joy looked down at her sleeping son. "They judged me without knowing the truth." Daniel sat beside her. "I could take you away from there," he said, "to Kampala. You and Samuel would have everything you need." Joy was silent for a long moment. Then she shook her head slowly. "That village is still my home." Daniel studied her carefully. Even after everything, Joy nodded. People made mistakes, but leaving would not heal anything. Daniel understood what she meant. "Then we return," he said. 2 days later, the convoy of black SUVs rolled once again toward the village near Mbale. This time, however, the arrival felt very different. Word had already spread. By the time the vehicles reached the square, many villagers were waiting. Some looked curious. Others looked embarrassed. Mama Barungi stood near the back of the crowd, avoiding direct eye contact. Daniel stepped out first. Then he helped Joy from the vehicle. She held baby Samuel carefully in her arms. The crowd fell silent. Joy walked slowly into the center of the square, the same place where she had once stood alone. But today, she was not alone. Daniel stood beside her. Jaja Namusoke followed closely. Mizikato stepped forward. His expression carried a mixture of dignity and regret. "Joy Nibiria," he said, quietly. "On behalf of this village, I owe you an apology." A murmur moved through the crowd. "We judged you too quickly." Joy looked around at the familiar faces. Some villagers lowered their eyes. Others nodded quietly. Mama Birungi stepped forward hesitantly. Her voice lacked its usual sharpness. "I spoke harshly," she admitted. Joy studied her for a moment. Then she spoke calmly. "What matters now is how we treat each other from this day forward." The tension in the square slowly eased. Daniel watched Joy with quiet admiration. Her strength had carried her through humiliation, and now that same strength was guiding the village toward healing. Mizikato nodded respectfully. "You and your child will always have a place here." Joy looked down at Samuel. A soft smile touched her face. The child who had once been the center of gossip had now become a symbol of something much deeper: truth, forgiveness, and the quiet power of dignity. As the villagers slowly gathered closer to greet the newborn, Daniel realized something. The woman beside him had never needed wealth to prove her worth. Her courage had done that long before he arrived, and that was exactly why he had fallen in love with her. The story of Joy Nibiria is not only about a young woman who was mocked by her village. It is about how quickly society can judge someone without knowing the full truth. Many people in life face moments like Joy did, standing alone while others assume the worst. But real strength is not found in anger or revenge. It is found in dignity. Joy never fought the villagers with cruelty. She simply refused to abandon her truth. And in the end, truth had a way of returning. Sometimes justice does not arrive quickly. Sometimes it travels slowly down a dusty road, carried by patience and courage. But when it finally arrives, it changes everything. If Joy's story touched you, take a moment to share your thoughts. Where are you watching from today, and what time is it in your country right now? Your voice matters, and stories like this remind us that kindness and fairness should always be stronger than judgment. And if you enjoy powerful stories about courage, justice, and hope, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who needs inspiration today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. Because sometimes the most unexpected journeys begin with a single act of kindness.